Servus zusammen, Grüezi miteinander, hello together. Today we learn about the religion of the Greeks, the Romans, and finally the Germans. It all has a continuing story, so I would suggest that you start at the beginning, but if you can't sit still in your seat, so maybe start with the Germans and afterwards you start again with the Greeks and listen to everything. But it's up to you. And if you haven't heard anything about our pagan past, I would highly suggest to watch this video. I know it's a little bit annoying computer science voice, but I think it's very good. So have a listen and tell me what you think about it. And of course you can also watch it in other languages, and the other languages are below. So in German, I think I will speak myself. The other languages I will have to let the lady talk, and I think Norse would be a very nice language to put down there as well. So if you have a request in which language you would like to hear this story, let me know. I will make a channel and provide you with the materials you need to learn everything about our heroic past.
The Greek, Roman and Germanic religion. We now have to deal with the religions that Christianity has supplanted in Europe. However, our knowledge of the Celtic and Slavic religions is so fragmentary and useful that we are hardly able to judge how they were constituted at the time of their expulsion by Christianity, what historical development they had undergone until then, or what contribution they had contributed to cultural development until then had gone through. In particular, the peculiar religious historical fact applies to them that peoples who appear new on the scene of world history like to equip themselves on this occasion with a cultural religion that confronts them, for example, for their world historical career. The religion of consideration has been Christianity among all these peoples. Having adopted this higher religion at the beginning of their historical existence, they forgot the pagan religion of their prehistoric existence. This gap in our knowledge of religious history may be particularly regrettable among the Celtic peoples, as there are many signs that they have already reached a proportionate level in their prehistoric life in general culture and religious development, and their mythical complexes, such as the Graal legend, were of great importance in the Christian Middle Ages. 1. Our knowledge of the Greek religion is most comprehensive. It will also have been by far the richest. In the religious field, 2. The Greek spirit demonstrated its ingenious fertility and creativity. We will do well to distinguish different strata in the religious development of the Greeks, without always following each other in time. They often go next to and confused. We believe at the moment that, apart from its inner richness, the Greek religion is an extremely captivating, almost unique problem, because here we are experiencing a millennium of millennia development from the primitive states of nomadic migratory tribes to the highest cultural bloom, and from then to religious track self-decomposition and all sorts of reformation attempts, and can usually prove them from a very rich source material. Despite penetrating research, the beginning of development is still often shrouded in darkness. It seems certain that we need to distinguish three main groups of religious facts, without, in many cases, from prehistoric times, a relatively highly developed Cretic-Mycenaean culture found by the immigrating tribes of the Greeks, especially on the coast and in the south, and the special world of the gods of the Greeks, who will have developed them relatively early in other Indo-European tribes. Animalist heritage has always been of greater scope and importance in the Greek religion than, for example, in Mosaism and Parisism, because never in Greece a large religious founder intervened deeply in the development and redesigned it from the ground up. Now that these animistic elements have a tough life everywhere and no need to hide in Greece as superstitions or other second-degree religion, it is not surprising that we find them growing abundantly at all stages of development of the Greek region. Almost all the basic elements of animist religion are abundantly represented. No trace of totemism has been shown so far. The distance between humans and animals has remained almost consistently greater than, for example, in the Indian religions or the Egyptian, and the bang structure of the phratries never seems to be based on this. Mana beliefs are prevalent for long distances. We note in particular two areas: taboo and fertility rites. Throughout life is governed by taboo rules that are particularly piling up at the critical points of human life: the high production, birth and death, on which occasions man more than usual is subjected to the influence of the force and the attacks of the forces. Certain herbs are placed next to the oneness to repel evil from her, and her clothes were removed in Athens by dedicating them to Artemis Baronia. On the 5th day after birth, The child was carried around the stove and thus joined a family. The closeness of death and the dead led to other dangerous forces, against which one tried to protect oneself in many ways. On the general feast of Anthesteria Sol, when the dead visited the houses and rubbed around everywhere, hawthorn was chewed and the door and body were scarred with bad luck. Most of the protective agents are called cleanings because they are intended to remove the dangerous force that passes like infection to anyone who comes into contact with it or even close to it. Anyone who visits a house where a dead person is laid out will be unclean and must purify himself. Therefore, reservoirs were set up in front of the mourning house so that those who went out could purify themselves by sprinkling with water. Water, fire and food will be contaminated and will have to be taken from abroad again. The field brewing probably played a major role with the Greeks even before the immigration in Hellas. Numerous customs and festivals have an agrarian character. Hesiod's works and days give numerous peasant rules. What fertility spells are used to bring the seed into the soil, ensure fertility for the plowed field, save the seeds from harmful effects during the weeks and months of growth, untrade the ripe harvest from the power of fruitability demons, restore the recovered grain in underground containers and chambers of protection. Of Pluton and how to treat the first loaves and porridges from the harvest obtained with double caution. All of these are the preservation and defense of mana and field and seed. The souls and soul ideas and breaku are not as varied as, for example, among the Malay peoples of Indonesia. They especially master the notions of death and life after death. The latter is presented as a forestry of this life. The dead man will then be given his equipment, especially since the weapons, to the grave. You have to give them food and drink too. Often tubes led them down to the dead bones. Minor people were forgotten, they also died in the afterlife. Great warriors and princes were considered powerful to good and evil even after their death. It is strange how, under the influence of Homer, these ideas have changed in a desolate, true soulless shadow kingdom as they were customary among the Semitic peoples. All nature was conceived by countless demons, ghosts and nymphs who drove their homes in the ocean, rivers and ponds, in the trees and mountains, on the crossroads, in caves and remote valley gorges. They had countless local cults, small sanctuaries, sacred trees, and maybe their own festivals. They had clung to the ground, so they rarely ascended the great, light world of gods. But her life was all the tougher. They have survived the rise and decline of the Greek religion, and in some cases even the centuries of Christian and ecclesiastical culture. It cannot be seen how much of this down-to-earth Pleidemonism the Greeks simply took on their immigration from their predecessors. The Cretic-Mycenaean culture has come to us in a mirage of large and small monuments, but without inscriptions and text. And the world that is revealed in it is so different from the Greek as well as from the Near East that it is difficult to draw certain conclusions from comparisons of how much of it has passed into the spiritual content of Greek religion. When the Aryans broke into India, they wrought their superior culture into a culturally poor country. They warned the actual cultural creators. Apparently, the Greeks found their conquest in Greece one of their then superior culture, which they assimilated. But how did this process happen? Here abandon the sources, because apparently, between the fall of the Mycenaean and the rise of Greek culture, there is a poor gap of several centuries. But most of the castles and princely castles of the Greeks were built on the foundations of Chionian castles, and the existing shrines in these existing shrines seem to be simply taken over, such as in Mycenae, Athens, and Eleusis. A goddess like Athena, whose name cannot be explained by Grecian, seems to be Cretic-Mycenaean origin with its large shield, the serpent accompanying her and characterized as a housekeeper, with its seat in the Mycenaean castle on the Acropolis of Athens. But even in those ancient times, the Grecian liked to take in gods immigrating elsewhere. Dionysus probably came from Thracia and seems to have been associated from the beginning with an orgiastic cult practiced by frenzied wives, manes. Artemis and her twin brother Apollo came from Asia Minor. However, Artemis may have grown out of the mountains, fields, and registers everywhere, and then took on a lot of other functions, perhaps by merging other gods with her. What the Syrian Apollo originally functioned is uncertain. He is the transmitter of disease and the god of salvation on Greek soil, and later, above all, the revelation mediator who gave Delphi the oracles highly revered throughout Greece. The Greeks probably had their own pantheon when immigrating to Hellas, like the Aryans when they burgled into India, but it is difficult to separate them their original share. If one used to have a great tendency to draw as many parallels as possible between the Greek and Indian gods, an invading study has shown their unreliability. While Diospida is already one of the almost lost gods in India, his counterpart, Zeus Pater, has had a profound position in Greece from the beginning, and all-time claims only whether he originally meant the light sky is doubtful. The elderly have never felt the tendency to simply deify natural or temperament appearances like the Indians and Iranians. Neither the sun, nor the moon and stars, neither Eos's dawn, nor even Eros as a god of love have ever played a role in his pantheon. Zeus is the god of natural phenomena related to agriculture, the thunderstorm and rain that make the field fertile. He is the giver of fertility and as such the earthy. Itonios, he sends up the gift of the bread folk. He is the buyer. Tesios, he is almost the peasant. Yorgos, he is at the same time the peasant. Yorgos, protectors of the courtyard enclosure from enemies and wild animals. Hekaios. Next to Zeus stood Hestia, the goddess of the domestic hearth, around which the simple life of the Greeks took place in those simple times. Demeter has perhaps evolved from the last rain gift of the field, which is considered by so many Indo-European peoples as the bearer of fertility and its guarantor for the new arable year. She is the goddess of agriculture. Hermes, too German, the one from the stone heap, perhaps owes its origin to the heap of stones piled up on the stations of the cross as a roadmap, and above the tombs of the dead. Thus he became the signpost and guide for living and deceased people. Athena, since she was a city goddess from her Mycenaean past, became the guardian of the city's crafts, especially women's practiced, of weaving art. The Greeks became sailors at an early age, given the special favor of their situation. Poseidon became of great importance as the god of the sea and of all waters in the country. The wild, stormy Ares had to do with the many large and small wars of the conquest. God came to God, the pantheon was populated by brought, native or reformed, and immigrated gods. We are unable to observe this gradual becoming. But in the Homeric chants this whole light world of gods stands before our eyes like a magic song. It must have been written and sung for centuries before the songs of the comps around Troy and the wanderings and homecoming of Odysseus were completed. And it may be mostly the knights nobility of the Ionic cities whose world is confronting us here. But Iliad and Odyssey act as one-piece works, and they have had a greater impact on the shaping of the religious world of Griechenland in the following centuries than any other single factor. Although the animistic manist underground of primitive religion often still shines through and has also asserted itself tenacious in sorcery and superstition outside of these poems, especially in local cults, in field, mountain, sea and source spirits, so we are nevertheless transferred to the world of the Olympic gods in these poems. Zeus, the father of gods and men, and Hera, his aristocratic wife, Apollo and Poseidon, Ares and Hephaestus, Aphrodite and Athena are in the forefront of religious interest. They are idealized and flourishly drawn people in large lines. They have their adventurous, sometimes quite daring livelihoods and do not be seized with crude adultery. They are jealous, envious. They are easy to change their mind, by incense and friendly vows, by donation and sacrifice theme. They soften the people with their requests when one is guilty of transgression and an offense. Iliad 9. Father Zeus, who rules from the Ida mountains, who sees and hears everything, also punishes the dead people in the depths and avenges perjury. But the dead dwell in the desolate shadows of Hades. Odysseus vividly shows how he drove to the west point of the earth beyond the Oceanos and from there found his way into eternal darkness. He slaughters the sacrificial animals with his companions and spills the donations of spice beer, sweet wine, water and white flour for all the dead, then the souls of the deceased, girls, young men, old people who had endured many things, gathered from Erebus, tender virgins, fresh from the pain of death, many in battle fallen men, wounded by tear lances, in bloody armor. Numerous, from all sides, they grabbed around the pit of sacrifice with whimsical shouting, Otis. 11:23 ff. There are still few temples and even fewer images of gods. Neither the severity of moral consciousness, nor the sublime calm of religious feeling, neither the sacred shyness of the impenetrable mystery nor the attraction of the mystical approach dominates this world of gods. It is an imaginatively embodious projection of the Hellenic spirit and life, thinking and feeling into those hero time of their history. Two currents have contributed particularly to the organization of religious life in the post-Homeric period. Measure, order is the main features of the Greek essence. He should also be asserting himself in the Greek religion. It has not produced a petrified rite with overloaded liturgies such as Hinduism or Buddhism. But it was up to her to bring the whole life of the individual from birth to death, agriculture through all seasons, the community life of the city, the traffic with the gods into firm and recognized rules. Religious tradition, superstition, love of order and a sense of justice contributed to this. In his works and days, Hesiod brought this mood into a poetic form. The lawmakers of the time, Adracan, Salon, Lycurgus and many others contributed their work to gliding the religious exercises into civil life and to place the latter under religious sanctions. It is a special merit of the Delphic Apollo, Bezel, the nationally recognized oracle site in Delphi, that in numerous directives and admonitions, often out of an astonishingly good knowledge of the circumstances and the feeling for the current needs, they promoted this organization of public life according to religious motives. The city-states in Griechenland were also so small that it was relatively easy to shape them. Each small city-state developed into a Christian state with its surrounding landscape. The care of religious service life at the national shrines became an important public matter. The great feasts of these gods were highlights of public life with magnificent processions, with the well-known public competitions, with simple but highly appreciated honors of deserved citizens, with theatrical performances of religious character, possibly donated to which the entrance fee was donated, with abundant food of the popular masses at the expense of the state purse, with the protrude and the temptations of a colorful ornament. This culture is not left to private initiative. He is a state issue and is classified by the city administration in all its obligations and is disputed from state resources. We have a detailed inscription from the city of Demetrius on the Pagasetic Gulf from the last century BC. There, apparently from ancient times, there existed an Apollo oracle that competed with the Delphic. Now the city administration decides to nationalize this oracle, since it is fair and appropriate, especially since the oracle is old and constantly upheld by our ancestors, and also strangers turn to the oracle in large numbers. The city should face more zealous plans for the dignified maintenance of the oracle, etc. Strange. This state organization of divination took place at a time when doubts and disbelief had long undermined the basis of Greek piety. This religious state enterprise, like a well-reared machine, could continue to run for centuries after the drifting internal forces had long since escaped. The nationalization of cultic life had two other surprising side effects. It became the base for heroic cult, which drift lush flowers in several centuries. From ancient times, in addition to the ancestors of their own family, who were only revered only in the family cult and soon forgotten, the ancestors of the clan, tribe, real or mythical, had found a general reverence. After all, the Zipper, the tribe was a large family, which was held together by the memory and celebration of the ancestors. Now when the great gods had established their heavenly aristocratic state on Mount Olympus, each state knew itself particularly attached to any of them. But after all, even Athena, Artemis, Apollo, Poseidon, not even talking about the Allen of Zeus, had to be somewhat impartial, because they had their sanctuaries in the various cities. The tribal heroes, on the other hand, applied only to the individual city-state. It could be reckoned with the never-ending military entanglements. It was the champion. He had to do everything through good and evil to help his people win the matter. While his tomb was known, it was the proven center of this heroic culture. Usually this was not the case, especially since the numerous mythical heroes. They built a cenotaph and invented a romantic myth and family tree that ended with preference in one of the great gods. And when, in the times of political and religious decline, tyrants and kings seized rule and power, the heroic cult became a convenient transition to the divine worship of those rulers. They became saving gods. The first archon became their priest. Their images were placed next to those of the gods in the peplos, the divine fake garment woven into it, which would be offered to the Athena at the Panathenaea. They were consecrated altars. Hero cult was even offered to their headers and Minikarians. However, some late degeneration of Greek religion, the other development led to an internalization, personalization of religion in the mysteries. These, too, date back to the oldest period of Greek religion, and much of them is uncertain and unclear about them, although the proliferating legend has encircled many things with myths. Probably the oldest mysteries were the Eleeuphonic ones, which were partly transferred to Athens at the time of the annulment of the small city-state of Eleusis in the Attic. Although sooner or later some minor motives were woven into the ordinances and ordinances, there appear to be two basic views. During the harvest next year, the seeds will be recovered in underground chambers to be taken out and sown next spring. In myth, this means that Demeter's daughter Core is robbed by the king of the underworld Pluton. The desolate mother looked for her all over the earth until she found her again in Hades. But she can only get Pluton to release her daughter for half a year, in the bright light of the sun, the idea of resurrecting life from death was tied. In the Dionysian mysteries introduced by Thrace, raging women, the Maenads, danced on the mountains and fake in the hallucination the god in an animal, seized it, tore it, and devoured the twitching, bloody limbs to become quite part of the fellowship with the deity. And this ardent desire for full communion with the deity, the enthusiasm filled with God, paved the way for this in itself ungruntled, wild wretch. These mysteries, with their dramatic representations, were intended to become the starting point for one of the highest developments in Greek art poetry, the tragedy. More influential than both of these mysteries mentioned were the Orphic, especially since they produced a great literature, which, of course, lost to us and deeply influenced even such miserable spirits as Plato. We hardly know what processes and myths are the basis of Orphism. The mythical singer Orpheus is said to have tamed all nature, humans and gods by the magic of his song. He is said to have freed his deceased wife Eurydice from the underworld by one hair. What is certain is that there will be profound speculation. The Teutons had torn and ate Zeus's son of Zagreb. In anger, she had crushed Zeus to ashes with her bullets, but then from the ashes she formed the people who thus connect the divine, titanic and earthly in their essence. The archetypus of the world is time, it formed a silver egg in the divine ether. From the egg emerged the first god, whose son Zeus then shook and ordered the earth. The deceased received the reward of their deeds in the underworld and, accordingly, they go to heaven or hell. Here in Orphism, ungracious notions of a completely individual retaliation after death appear in itself, and are then soon plastically depicted by the great painter Polygnot in a poignant painting. With this survival after death, the idea of the migration of souls, which was further developed by the Pythagorean philosophers after Orphism, goes hand in hand. As far as we can see, the mysteries as a private religion of small, deeply religious circles in the centuries before Homer had had a great influence to the Purposine Wars, but then they were very overshadowed by the public religion of the cities, only until centuries later, when this state public religion had lost its strength, in connection with the religion immigrating from the Orient to come to new importance. The religious thoughts and poetry of those long series of great Hellenes, which in the 6th, 5th and 4th centuries penetrated and dig deeper by a world of thought of classical Hellenism. In Herodotus, these ancient, genuinely Greek thoughts of the jealousy of the gods against too much happiness or power, and of the hubris, the exaggeration of man beyond his narrow limits. But they are outshone by the generous help that the Olympic gods have given to the Greeks against the army of the army. The Greek gods are the champions of Greek freedom. Pindar knows that it is appropriate to say only good and beautiful things about the gods. The adventures and bad things that are accused to them are just shining lies. In doing so, the Thitcher thinks a lot about the offending, testing or blessed destinies of the soul after death. Aeschylus, 525–456, the great contemporary of Buddha and Confucius, ennobles the myths and knows of a moral world order that is also above the gods. If they have done wrong, they must repent. But the supreme godhood is the King of Kings, whose throne is not ruled by any throne, the blessed among the blessed, the power of the powers which operate tirelessly throughout the distance of time. He is an unfathomable thought, the depth of which would be able to measure foolishness. He is irresistible will to be measured by dark ways of carrying out his plans, unsearchable to man, unsearchable paths advances for man to the infallible execution of his plans. He is the supreme cause, the author of all actions. Zeus is the ether, Zeus is the earth, Zeus is the sky, Zeus is everything and more, if there is. Sophocles is strongly under the impression of how helpless human life is, and to the entanglements and needs of the incomprehensible enigma of the gods, to which man must patiently and humbly submit. But Antigone knows an unwritten, eternal law, which she obeys even against the will of King Creon at the risk of her life. Socrates is animated by utter moral pathos of doing good without regard to the consequences, even if it were death. He wants to encourage the superficial and amusement people to think and deepen morality. He is guided by his daimonian, an instinctive but sure sense of the right and expedient, so it is not equivalent to the conscience, the warner against evil. Socrates' own world of thought does not reflect the speculation placed in his mouth about the immortality of the soul and the migration of souls, in Phaedon, but the calm serenity in the face of death, moral trust in God, and the clear security of the profession recognized as a divine mission, in the Phaedon. Apology. This series of moral offenders comes to its completion in Plato, the deepest and richest spirit of old Hellas. About this world of ideas, of archetypals, of which things on earth are only weak and imperfect images. This supreme idea is that of good and therefore God. God, being good, cannot be the cause of everything, including evil. God always sits the same, true in word and deed. It is difficult to discover the origin and the father of the universe, and if it has been discovered, it is impossible to reveal it alone to others. For this reason, Plato Cretan exercises criticism of the myths of the gods out of religiosity. Nothing can and should be denoted to the gods that would be unworthy of them. The migration of souls is a process of purification, and ascent is very sympathetic to the philosopher. In all these poets and thinkers we find serious religiosity, seeking to penetrate them with religious and ethical thought, a brittle material of popular beliefs, cult habits and abundantly proliferating myths. So to serve folk religion the service of good theology. They were only successful to a limited extent. Once the Greek spirit was far too rich and multifaceted to commit to certain religious beliefs. Then lurked in the background the religiously unaffirmable thoughts of a fate above the gods, a brazen necessity of world events, without these true religiosity, as in Babylonia, being associated with an astral mythological worldview, but the Tyche, Moria, the Aesir, the Home-Mena, as the dark names of the blind forces of evil are called, nevertheless repeatedly intersped the idea of the moral world order and did not allow it to enter into dominion in and uninhibited. To this end, the beautiful divine service in the temples, the masterpieces of art, the accomplished gods of Ophidia and Praxitele, and even more so the under-beautiful, but realistically effective cults of the old gods in the city and the country were too strong a counterbalance to the poetic or philosophical refinements and idealizations. The Hellenes too much perceived the gods as a gesite of their spirit and flesh of their flesh, to allow themselves to be lifted up morally by the thought of God in the long run and in the same way. This is why these efforts to deepen and purify religious beliefs are inspired by a first astonished, then ironic, then biting satirical creed to the gods, and further next to her efforts to establish a science independent of myth and folk religion. Certainly, the Hellenes have made tremendous progress in human culture, establishing scientific principles for the brightening of natural processes. It revealed the peculiar power of the Greek spirit to lovingly immerse oneself in the surrounding environment and to trace its laws of life, rather than, like Indian thinkers, in the unilateral direction to the unity of the universe, which is about the multiplicity of manifestations, the sense of reality, and to lose differences in the world. But for Greek religiosity, this direction of precise scientific research was disastrous. It had a decomposing and cooling effect. Even the poet Theonis wrote, "Dear Zeus, I wonder about you. For thou hast reigned over all, thine is honor and great power, thou knowest the mind and mind of every little mash, and thine is the utmost authority over all things, O king. How does your mind be to cautious men as equal to the righteous, whether their mind is educated to moderation, or to arrogance among men who are tempted to act unjust?" The slightly younger Hexaphanes of Colophon Pons, mortals believe that the gods were born and, like them, they have clothing, voice, and form. But when the children, the horses horse-like, paint the children of cattle like gods and form bodies of such shape as they would have. His criticism, however, is directed only at the conceptions of God, not the idea of God. Rather, he judges, a single God is the greatest of gods and men, neither externally like man nor in his mind. That is why it is good to sing to the glory of the gods and ask them for strength to do what is right. More critical is Heraclitus of Dunkle. He says the gods are immortal humans, humans are mortal gods. Worship statues is as foolish as to speak with walls. Wishing to purify yourself through the blood of the victims is to wash with dirt. From such ambiguous words speaks at least a cool restraint to the gods and worship. Only then came the Greek Enlightenment, initiated by men such as the Dr. Hippocrates and the naturalist Democritus, the inventor of atomic theory. They realized that the sun is a glowing mass of iron or stone, that rain and thunder are not sent by the gods, but develop the laws of nature at night. Were there any gods beyond the nature process? Wasn't Euhemerus of Mycenae right, who learned that the gods were only deified humans or natural phenomena or celestial bodies? Thus began a critical and rational study, which began to dissolve the gods and the stories of the gods through allegories or etymologies. After all, the Greeks were very intellectualistic, and many put their wit and ingenuity to rub against the gods and the stories of the gods. Now the colourful mythological dress of the ancient faith of God proved to be more of an obstacle to true piety, for some, as for the Roman Ovid, the myths turn into funny fables, while others, such as Lucian, poured out the poisonous liquor of their aciding satire. Since the legends of the gods no longer gave the educated a firm backing of their lives, surrogates were created by philosophical fiefdoms. While religions have the great merit of being the intellectual property of entire peoples, these philosophies, so to speak, remained secret doctrines of small literary circles, and in the spraying of the Hellenic spirit they changed with great ease. 3 philosophical directions have competed for sway and influence in the past few centuries before and the first after Jesus Christ. By far the noblest and most prestigious was the Stoa, led by men like Zeno, Cleanthes, the virtuous Seneca, the pious lame Phrygian slave Epictet, in whose poor body a sublime soul dwelt, and Emperor Aurel. This direction reacts the regularity of the course of nature. Behind nature, however, stands in sublime calm the absolute deity, which is unattainable by our mind. May God be the witness of our actions, let our life be like an open book before God. The glory of man is to be fully subject to God's will. This is done by harmoniously fit into nature and follow it. The changing world events with its temporary rain, storm and sunshine, however, must be opposed to moral equanimity or heroism. If this direction was to be created in the face of a society degenerating moral backbone and iron in the blood, the direction of epicurses served much more, at least in practice, to reinforce the lush prosperous upper classes of the people in self-pleasing enjoyment. The gods have created and established the world, but since then they have withdrawn from it and left it to its law. They live in blissful calm. Not to ask anything from them, but for their own refinement, their worship is recommended. This is a religious direction for the aristocracy with the slogan, "I hate the mean mob." Even more devastating was the frivolous mockery of cynics such as Antisthenes and Diogenes, who in their self-sufficiency did not mean that the gods would not be in need of their self-sufficiency. While some of the witty rationalism disheveled the colourful, old world of gods, some of which the various philosophical directions procured surrogates, a new era of religious life was already approving. Since Alexander the Great founded his empire and merged Orient and Occident into one unit, a larger scale of exchanges of spiritual goods between Hellas and the Orient took place from human age to age. Hellas led his higher intellectual culture, his poetry and philosophy, his architecture and civic foundations to the Orient. From there he not only drew the coveted trade and luxury items, but also sent a lot of religious secrets. From the East, star faith and the underlying worldview of the correspondence of heaven and earth, in connection with this flowed in various magic, divination, dream interpretation. The spiritual and religious exchange took on a much larger scale when the Romans had established their empire and now endeavored to combine the widely spaced and divergent parts of the empire into a cultural unit with their own state art. Now the Oriental religions were just taking a triumphant march into the Mediterranean world of Greece and Rome. Not that the gods of Greece are deposed or forgotten. But in addition to their long naturalized cults, new forms of worship emerged. And it was curious that the religions introduced from the Orient once often used religious forms and forms to the fore, which had hardly been in the forefront of domination in the old homeland, and that the new religions pretended to accept the peculiar stepmal of mystery cults or unite, which gave them in had been a stranger to their homeland. The changes are most wondrously in the cult of Mithras. Mithras had certainly been one of the ancient Indo-Pyrrhic folk gods, whether the moon or the sun god, can hardly be decided. In the Iranian religion of Zarathustra, Frph reappeared among the Jazadas, so to speak, the second-degree archangels, without being at the center of religious worship. From the 2nd century onwards, he began his triumphal march through the Greco-Roman world, and for a century he struggled with Christianity for the primacy as a world religion. So it gained such paramount importance on other soil in this late period as he had never possessed in his home countries, in Iran or India. It seems that in the Oriental mystery cults, certain basic religious needs of the Greeks were met for satisfaction, the specifically Hellenic desire for immortality by overcoming the fate of death, the union or merging with the deity through the cult meal, baptisms or other sacramental actions, the expectation of a world redeemer, a Soter who will put the world out of joint in order, as well as the tendency deep in the essence of religiousness to rise to deity by exaggerating real or supposed religious conditions in trance or ecstasy, and the religious experience with the magic of the mysterious to surround. It did not matter so much whether these needs were in the form of the Egyptian Isis or Serpis mysteries, or the Phrygian Cybeleatus mysteries or the Syrian Adonis or Iranian Mithras. Only the cultural forms were different. And even Dabi, The prayer and anthem often kept themselves at such a funny height that they could be served with minor changes to any of the mystery gods. Now, in late antiquity, the Greek spirit still took reproach to a larger style worldview, to the Neoplatonism of an Ammonius Saccas, Plotinus, Porphyrius, Iamblichus, Hypatia and other Hellenes of the 3rd, 4th and 5th centuries after Christ. This philosophy sought to combine the philosophical heritage of the classical past and centuries that followed, religion and piety of the masses and mystery associations and the elements of worldview that have flowed from the Orient into one unit. The primordial ground of the world is the absolute, the non-existent, which in a biotial concealment am approachable. From him was the result of a gradual ingrading process of emanation, spiritual potentials, which eventually materialized in this world. So this is a hierarchy of mentality, nous, logoi, rational beings, gods, souls that descend from infinite deity, pure spirit, to matter as if on a scale, one of the many futile attempts to come to a monoistic world estimation of the spirit by assuming that the spirit has itself in mind materialized a descending coarsening process. This gives the task of salvation. The spirit must free itself from the bands of matter. Philosophical reflection, asceticism, mystical mediation and other exercises are used for this. The highest, however, is that one rises in mystical ecstasy to the blissful view of the reigning deity. Of course, one cannot force or elaborate this sublime spirit swing. He falls to the humble waiters like a gift of grace from the Godhead. In the light of this mystical ecstatic monoism, the myths of the gods must be interpreted by virtue of a proliferating allegorical interpretation or reinterpretation. Homer's epics, due to such allegory, become straight canonical books of this philosophy. It is instructive that Greek philosophizing and Greek piety, after an evolution of more than a millennium, despite the Greek openness and worldliness, achieved a philosophy of spiritual monism. The mind is the one, only world principle, and the task of man, this pure spirituality, certainly to become. Thus, in completely different ways, Greek religious philosophy or philosophical religion attains approximately the same goals of the All-One as the Indian infantry. It is a peculiarly rich and diverse picture that the Greek religion has shown us in its development spanning more than a millennium. We like to remember that it has often been the religiosity that inspired the Greek spirit to its most ingenious creations. Religion has created the classical Greek architectural styles, the Doric, Ionian and Corinthian. They have come to their highest completion at temples of the gods. Religion has inspired the sculptors among the most complete marble statues of the gods, the Olympic Zeus, the Athena of Parthenon, the Venus of Milo, the Apollo of Belvedere are among the most beautiful and exalted human hands. Religion, especially the Dionysian mysteries, has given rise to the tragedies of an Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides. And yet we divorce the Greek religion with a sense of disappointment. She has not been able to render the highest service to her people, to give him a firm backbone in the storm of times in a sublime thought of God for his thinking and for his moral action. The gods of Greece have become too human, but that is why the Greeks have become too little divine. It would be a worthwhile task to assign how great spiritual heritage the Greek religion has left to its successor, the Christian Church. In any case, one will understand how Christianity, which originates from the despised, culturally poor barbarian land of Palestine, managed to run and eliminate it in a rapid victory of barely a quarter of a century. Christianity brought what the Greek religion lacked: a great, clear, sacred thought of God, a firm morality and moral order of life, and a closed religious community with the close bond of brotherly love and the global horizon of the kingdom of God. 2. If we have studied the Greek religion in more detail, we can take care of the Roman religion all the shorter. It is a curious proof of how little Romanism has been creatively active in the field of higher spiritual life. A. We divide the history of Roman religion into 4 sections. The first runs until the end of the royal period, that is, until Tarquinius Superbus. At that time, the concepts of God were still simple and informal, the gods were little individualized, myths, temples and images of the gods were still scarcely present. The 3 main gods, combined into a trinity, were Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinius. Jupiter flows more or less with the sky. As Jupiter Eber he is the donor of wealth, as Jupiter Fulgur he is asked for rain, as Jupiter Feretrius he meets with his thunderbolt, as Jupiter Elysius he is asked for rain, as Jupiter Phidias he watches over the treaty. In all cases, he has a few personal or individual traits. The favorite god of the Romans was Mars, later especially revered as the ancestor of the Julian imperial house. Quirinus swallowed again in the morning. Of other gods, those related to the house and the family stand out in particular: Janus, the god of the front door; Janua, then the opening of the month, of the calendars, and the year; Januarius, and Vesta, the goddess of the domestic hearth. The national community was considered to be a large family, the king as its house priest in the temple of Vesta, since the inside, and since fire, as in so many other religions, has the power of purification, as in so many other religions, it must be pure virgins. A third, especially numerous, group of deities or geniuses are the caretakers of all individual obligations of domestic life and agriculture as the main occupation. One Sterculinus guards fertilization, one Veuactor guards the first, the repairer the second, the Impasitor the third ploughing, the Insister the sowing, the Abarator the usual ploughing of the seed, the Acator the harrow, the Sagester the growing stalk, the Nodotus, the Volutina the bud formation, the Volutina the bud formation, the Flor the flower, and so on. Likewise, many genius cultivate all individual responsibilities from birth to death. Other deities are little more than abstractions, such as Fides, Concordia, Prudentia, and so on. The sacrifices were offered to the gods after an embarrassingly precise ritual. The indigitamenta, the sacrificial forms and invocations of the gods, were an important part of religious tradition. The strict formality of the ancient Roman era was expressed in it. Own cooperatives, so-called sodalitia, had to perform certain parts of these religious obligations by the state, such as the three flamines, the landlord brothers of our vale, the warlike dancers Salii, and the supervisors of the sacrificial cult of pontifices. On the whole, it was a simple, rigorous religious exercise that did not exactly betray deep spiritual holdings and did not particularly stimulate the religious mind. It was an indispensable piece of the fixed way of life in the state, family, and agriculture. B. The second pre-Iode, from the end of the kingdom to the end of the Second Punic War, is the period in which the Roman city-state developed into the Italian rural state and shaped its social and legal forms. Characteristic of this was the development of the culture of Jupiter Optimus Maximus as the merging of Roman world domination in a magnificent temple on the Capitol. In addition, the traces of foreigners have already been asserted in the religious practice. The most striking were the Sibyllic books. From the point of view of the Delphic oracle, Psi had formed Apollo oracles in many cities of Hellenic culture and colonization circle, which give their truths by Sibyl as prophets. A famous such oracle was located in Ciumi, Lower Italy. The Sibyl there had offered the last Roman kings an extensive collection of their fortunes, the so-called Sibylline books. The king had reluctantly bought a remnant of it after the Sibyl burned the greater part of it. These books were preserved as a sanctuary in the cellars of the Capitoline Temple and questioned three impending dangers. They were not a matter of future prophecies, but rather defensive measures for dangers or extraordinary natural events. The questioning of these mysterious books was henceforth part of the regular practice of the Roman people in times of need. In 204, such an oracle demanded that, in view of the imminent danger of the Punic armies of Hannibal, the Magna Mater be invited and transferred from Phrygian Pessinus to Rome. With him came the strange cult of the great Phrygian goddess, her priests, the Archaigalli, who had emasculated, celebrated their exciting festivals and processions in the streets of Rome under rushing music. It was the first example of an official transplantation of a foreign and frem cult into the Roman capital. It was precisely this development that became characteristic for the following third period, from the end of the Second Punic War to the end of the Republic. Rome's not exactly a number of religious heritage became almost overwhelgated by the multifaceted, mythical pantheon of Greece. The native gods, the indigetes, had to take pleasure that next to them newly settled gods, the novanides or consenters, were given home law. The easiest way to do this is to identify the Greek gods with Latin, which were somewhat equivalent to them, and thus simply transferred their cults, attributes and myths to them, and these gods were then schematically assembled into married couples. Zeus was identified with Jupiter, Hera with Juno, and thus formed the Jupiter-Juno pair of gods. Poseidon was identified with Neptunus, Athena with Minerva, and Demeter's pair of gods Neptune-Minerva. Ares was identified with Mars, Aphrodite with Venus, and thus formed the pair of gods Mars-Venus. Apollo was newly acquired, next to him Hestia identified with Vesta, thus forming the pair of gods Apollo-Vesta. Hermes was identified with Mercurius, Demeter with Ceres, and thus formed the Mercury-Ceres pair of gods. It is obvious that in this process the ancient Roman gods became something completely different from those of prehistoric times. They also attracted Greek garb and Greek forms of worship as the educated Romans gleaned. Not only did the Greek pantheon move to Rome, but at the same time all the criticism of religion and satire, the rationalizing reinterpretation of Euhemerus, the philosophical schools and their religious orogates. And as faith declined, which unbelief was considered noble, so in silence the bust superstition, dream interpretation, astrology, horospies, bird's eye view, and so on grew. The imperial period, the fourth period, began with a great attempt to restore the ancient religion, just as one sought to revive the habitats and virtues of ancient Rome in other areas of life. The old gods returned to honor, the old rites were restored as accurately as possible, and the old sodalitia were restored. In addition, the introduction of foreign religious goods continued, but it was no longer brought from Greece. This had already been thoroughly plundered, nor did it provide enough nerve church for the aging of Roman society. On the other hand, how much more mysterious and magnificent did the Oriental mystery religions appear? One after the other by these mystery gods, Attis, Isis Osiris, Mithras, among others, they received their temple in Rome and were thus officially recognized. But the characteristic trait of this outgoing Roman era was not in the artificial restoration or in the introduction of the mystery cults, but in the imperial cult. At first you will probably have overgrown in the Orient, where from time immemorial there was a tendency to surround the princes with divine rank. Let us say it more precisely, according to the doctrine of the correspondence of heaven and earth, the supreme God in heaven was the Lord, but also the king as his representative on earth, and since one considered one's own country as the epitome of the cosmos, as a counterpart of the heavenly world, divine honors flowed to the ruler as if by itself. World redemption expectations associated with this idea of world ruling around the great turn of the era, could it not be seen in an emperor like Augustus, who, after a century of civil wars and devastation of the world, had brought an unprecedented upsurge of prosperity and traffic to all countries? By adopting some Oriental ideas, the Roman religion linked it to the genuine Roman idea of imperial unity, which had previously had its symbol in the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitol. Wasn't there the opposite image of the kingdom in heaven in the world stretching the known earth? Wasn't the emperor the embodiment of the supreme ruler? It did not matter if the worship of the genius of the living or the man of the deceased emperor himself worshipped as a deity. In any case, the imperial cult became the snibboleth of the empire, and it was all the more convulsive to it, the more its foundations were undermined by turmoil inside and enemies from outside. It was almost tragic that it was precisely at this point that the dying Roman religion was involved in a passionately agitated struggle against Christianity. This brought another kingdom of heaven on earth and another king of the kingdom, and the Christians themselves, at the highest risk of death, refused to grant the emperor the worship that was due only to their heavenly King Jesus Christ. It was, however, the consequence of this escalation of the tragic conflict that, at the moment when Christianity finally won, the Roman state religion was given death blow. She had sought to support herself by identifying with the state, it was therefore abolished at the moment when this state became Christian. About us Germans. 3. The Greek and Roman religions had already been in disintegration and dissolution when Christianity came upon them. The Germanic religions were apparently still in their youth freshness. They would like to compare them, for example, with the stage of development of Greek religion in the Homeric religion, the Indian religion in the Vedic era. Unfortunately, our knowledge of them is inadequate. We probably know that the Teutons fell into three large groups: the southern Germanic tribes, Frisians, Marches, Alamans, Suvers, Ingavans, and Eistavans; the western Bremens, Anglo-Saxons; and the northern Germanic Germans, Swedes, Danes, Norwegians, and Icelanders. Only from the northern Germans, and only from their Icelandic branches through the two Eddas, the Saardunder Edda and the Snorre Edda, have a sufficient account of their religious possessions, their cults and myths. Incidentally, we have many fragments, which can only be combined into a uniform image with the help of a lot of imagination. The type of Germanic religions is perhaps best understood when we compare it with the Homeric religion and look at the distance of the sunny, happy climate, country and life from the wild struggle for existence in storm and weather, swamp and jungle, rocky deserts and waves in the harsh northerners, and accept that this wild nature of unbridled defiance, striving for distant drive to the distance, has produced men of steel and hearts full of golden fidelity and tender many. It is difficult to say how the true, deep religiosity of the Teutons has merged into a unity with the nobility of their characters and the ferocity of the surrounding nature and is reflected in the gods and myths. Two basic views seem to pass through the entire Germanic religious world like a common thread. They touch with animistic mana and kinship solidarity ideas, as we found in the primitive peoples, except that they are refined and deepened here. The Teutons have a deep sense of the vitality that is decided in the cantar. The king or chief wears them in an increased degree and is to make them work for the welfare of his people, for the fertility of the field and for victory in battle. She rests in particular in the badge of his dignity. When he is equipped with the armring, sword and spear, he is thus inviting him to gain greater insight and strength. The badges also work for themselves when the king sends them to war with his army. A crime of a tribal limb burdens all clappers, the curse rests on them all as long as it remains unpunished, and the blood vengeance of the damaged clan is not directed against both the culprit and his clan. The mysterious power of blessing and curse is efferent by the spoken word, that of the dying father for his children, that of the king for his people. It is a gender-effective power. With the transfer of a besitsum, that is, the sale of a land or the gift of a sword, you give a part of your soul to other hands. You will do this in solemn forms and tell the recipient the story of the gift. The clan dedicates to the victim through a joint vow the forthcoming march of war or the new sowing, the newly concluded marriage or the child born by the blessing at the round drink. The carousings thus have religious value and have therefore continued unchanged in the Christian period. In addition to such traits that defy the changing times, it would appear that Germanic religion has undergone profound changes. There was probably a time when the divine and the gods were hardly individually separate, so the gods did not have proper names or easily exchanged them, so that the same gods were called differently in different tribes and at different times. Above all, the Viking Age, from the 7th to the 10th century, has sustainably transformed the character of the Nordic peoples, and thus also left its mark on their world of gods, the faithful reflection of folklife. At that time, the original ethical principles of happiness and honor came to full development. Happiness is the unity of the clan established in the community of life, which is evident in the appearance of similarity, habits, prejudices, the same memories, the same pride, the same goals. Honor is the preservation of this common heritage in the past, present and future. Both are to be preserved and merging by using your life in fresh Tattendrange. You move out into the world with bold daring, you discover and conquer new lands, you gain honor and wealth, or you go down in heroic warfare. Especially from this time of high spreading, we have the most extensive literary documents among the Nordic peoples. It is quite possible that much of what the two Eddas tell us will only belong to the concrete expression of this Viking era. We have too few concrete records from other Germanic areas to correct this colorful Nordic image. We therefore give the following sketch with the caveat that not everywhere and not at all times the Germanic religion has worn these bright colors. Throughout the world, in sunshine and storm, in fields and forests, in rock and sea, the pious Germanic eye sees ghosts, elves, mermaids, dwarfs, goblins, the clever women Edasi, in Sweden the Tomte, Hudinas but also fiddles, witches and forest weavers. Above this small ghost race, on the one hand, rise the wild raw giants, the fetuses and thyrses, in which the untamed forces of nature live. They are enemies of the land and life created by culture. On the other side are two light gods, the Vans and the Isis, without being able to distinguish their ratio exactly, but the Isis are in the foreground. They are the great gods of the living. Three Isis form the typical trinity of the supreme gods, Tyr or Tyr, the road god of almost all Germanic tribes, since they were all home fightful. The Roman writers identify him with Mars. The day of Mars, Mardi, is therefore Tuesday, Tuesday. Next to him is Thor or Donner, the clumsy, good-natured main god of farmers, who gives rain and growth with thunder and lightning. But he also protects against disease. He is full of goodness and righteousness. With his hammer he consecrates marriage and secures the greens of property. It is arbitrary if the combination of Latin writers has compiled him with Jupiter, the nature of which he has little. So he owns Jupiter's day, Jew, as a Thursday. The third, probably the youngest, is Odin or Wotan, the furious, the god of storms, especially the winter storms. Wotan's wild army, the spirits of those killed in battle, race with him in a dark night through the woods and mountains. He rules the furious battle. His weapon is the spear. His sacred animals are the ravens that crawling over the bodies of the slain on the battlefield. He rides on his fast, 8-legged steed Sleipnir. The brave warriors, however, who have fallen on the Wallstatt, bring the Valkyrie to Valhalla, Wotan's ruling hall, where they drink mead and eat pork every day, but also beat each other bloody every day to get along peacefully. As a result, Wotan also becomes the god of the dead or their spirits. But he is also the god of runes and thus the wisdom of knowledge of the past and future. From Jotun Mimir he drank wisdom from his well, and for this he put his eye as a pledge. Never be, he is as love-hungry as Greek Zeus, and his love and his wife's jealousy form a popular theme of myths. The Romans have strangely identified him with Mercurius, so Wednesday, Mercredi, is his day, Wednesday. In addition to these three gods, many others appear more in myths. Frey, or Fro, the Swedish god of fertility, which is therefore also represented by a particularly large symbol of procreation, the light Balder, the evil Loki, the blind Hoeja. Only two of goddesses emerge somewhat more clearly, Frigga or Freya, the wife of Wotan or Odin, and Nerthus, the goddess of spring fertility of the earth. Tacitus writes about this. Many Germanic tribes believe that Nerthus will intermeddle in human affairs and drive around the peoples in a wagon. On an island of the ocean is a sacred grove, and inside it is a sacred wagon covered with a cloth. Only the priest is permitted to touch him. He knows when the gods is present in the sanctuary, and dragged by cows, he guided eyes with great reverence. Then there will be happy days, everywhere, festivals where the goddess comes and hospitable reception is honored. Then there is no war, one does not take up arms, all iron remains closed, peace and tranquility then reigns until the same priest returns the goddess to her sanctuary after she has dwelt enough time among men. On it, the wagon, the scarves and, if you believe it, the deity itself are washed in a secret lake. Scalven do the work that the same lake immediately devours, that means they are drowned in the lake. Tacitus, Germania chapter 40. The wife, child and man onto ships to emigrate to Iceland. He also removed the sanctuary, the court, and took most of its entablature with him, and also earth under the altar stones, the stable on which Thor had his seat. Arriving in Iceland, he threw the Högsharpen pillars overboard and vowed to build a new sanctuary for the Thor, where he had them land. That was a court path. There he built a great sanctuary, a very large house with doors in the side walls at the ends of the house. Inside stood the high-seating pillars, and the holy nails, the wretched nailers, were smashed into them. There was a great cemetery. In the innermost part was a hermitage, there was a stable, the altar, in the middle of the floor. On it lay an open ring, weighing 2 oars. Every oath should be sworn upon this ring, and the priest, God, should carry it by his arm in every assembly. When a great sacrifice, a blot, study, the peasants came together far and wide, each brought his food bag with them, because the celebration probably lasted a whole week. All kinds of flocks were slaughtered, including horses. From the blood they stained with from the altars, the stable, and the walls of the temple, the courtyard, outside and inside red, sprinkled with them the walls. The meat was cooked for the banquet. A fire burned in the middle of the temple, a cauldron above mug was carried over the fire. He who hosted the sacrificial meal, blessed the cup and sacrificial food, the first cup on Odin for the king's power and victory, the second on Njord, probably Nerthus, and Frey for blessing and peace, the third on the ancestors. Mini means souvenirs. They also sacrificed in the front thing, where the men gathered for the council. In this circle stood Thor's stone, above which the back of the men who were to be sacrificed was broken. Or the sanctuary was just a heap of stones, a horn, by a rock, in a grove, or under a widely shadowy tree. The feasts of sacrifice were holy times when the clan believed itself filled with divine power. Happy were the heroes who had fallen on the Wallstatt in the bloody battle. The others came to Hell, meaning the cave, to his gloomy shadow kingdom. That was in the bosom of the mountains. There, too, the new arrivals were welcomed by the comrades with the noise of voices and drinking horns. But the dead could, for example, come back to the living, much like in Berger's famous ballad. King Helga's widow Sigrun is inconsolable at the death of her husband. He arrives attacking at midnight. Sigrun goes out to him, I will kiss the lifeless king before he takes down the bloody brooder. Your hair, Helga, is heavy from the hoop, the inlet is completely covered with blood tone. You made it, Sigrun, to cover Helga with blood. You cry, you gold-adorned bittertear, each one falls bloody on the prince's chest. Sigrun will make a bed for him in the hill. Here I have prepared a bed for you, Helga, where you can rest fearlessly. Here I, Prince, want to sleep in your bosom, just as I did to the living king. Helge has to go back to the realm of the dead at dawn. Sigrun follows him soon in death with sorrow and pain. The ancient Germans were thoughtful people. They were deeply concerned about the beginning of the world and the end of the world, after the divination of the Wolva, Voluspa. You read this mighty poem. At the end of the earth, where the sea ends, there is a tremendous gullet from which the sea gushes out, Punic War, gaping fermentation. North of it is freezing cold. There is Niflheim, the cloud world. Here is the fountain of Helgelmir, from which the 20 ice streams emerge that pour into Ginnungagop. To the south of the Schlend is Muspelsheim, the fire world. From here, too, there are streams that carry burning water with them. These are the Oliviga. When they mingled with the ice flows, the frost formed, and from this interaction of cold and heat, the first being, the giant Ymir, emerged. When he slept, he got sweated, and soon grew under his arms man and woman, new giants. At the same time, the cow or humula emerged from the melting maturity, from whose udders run milk streams that fed the giants. The cow itself was narrowing on the salt of rice stones in Binanagap. But as she so animated the stones, 2 giants were created, Boron and Besla. Their children were Odin, Willi, and We. They killed the original giant Ymir and built the earth from his corpse. So much of the fantastic creation of the world, which shimmers in other relations in other colors. More powerful are some myths of the World War, the Ragnarok or the Twilight of the Gods. Ever since Thor overdrew the treaties with the giants by his twist, preparations have been made for the great battle between the Aesir and the Teutons. On his side are all the dark forces, on Thisthi and Hirja. The Fenris wolf, the roaring Garm, tears apart its shackles. There is war and fornication among the humans. The mountains of waves rise, which shake Feltisha Yggdrasil. Heimdall, the guardian of the god castle of Asgard, blows into the horn, while Odin consulted with the head of the giant Mimir. This is a battle of all against all. Odin falls in battle against the Fenris wolf, but is immediately avenged by his son Vidar. Thor and the Midgard serpent are both supposed to fight each other. Frey falls by the sword of Sits. Then Surt throws the fire into the gods' dwelling and destroys them. Now the earth is sinking into the floods. But it emerges anew, a new heaven and a new earth, a new generation lives in a golden hall. It is like the demise of the Germanic world of gods under the entry of Christianity in this enormous poem from the end of World War, but at the same time with the hopeful outlook for a new, more beautiful world time. From the Voluspa, the song of the end of the world. Huge Garm barks before the nip cavity, the feta tears, the wolf escapes. I know the news, far I look far, the gods mighty Ragnarok, the gods of destiny. Brethren slain until both fall, and betters destroy their kindred, the world is desolate, they commit adultery, there is none that spares the other. Now the sons of Mim play their game, the decision is threatening the old horn, Heimdall blows the horn loudly in the air, the inhabitants of hell are shaking. Yggdrasil trembles, the steady ash, the primeval tree of the fiend crests. Odin is looking for a customer of Mim's button, as the Surt son wraps him himself. Huge Garm bark in front of the nip cavity, and so on, as in the first paragraph. Now comes the mighty son of the earth, Odin's son is approaching the dragon, furious is the Midgard's guardian, all the people run from home. The fame saved. But Thor was dead, 9 umbrellas he departed from the unbeen. The sun turns black, the land sinks into the sea, from the sky the bright stars fade. The smoke rastens, the low hay burdens, the heat strikes up to the sky. Huge Garm bark in front of the nip cavity, and so on, as in the first paragraph. I see the land rising out of the sea for the second time, animated by greenery. Falls falling from the rock, the owl flies over catching fish. The Isis gather in the Eiderfelder, speak of the powerful Arunsklinger, also commemorate the tremendous things and the great of God's ancient runes. Unsown will carry the field. Evil gives way, Walder is coming. Hod and Walter will build Odin's camp Hof again. One room I see standing, brighter than the sun, with a golden roof, on Gimleberg. There shall a generation of the righteous dwell, and enjoy peace and prosperity forever. Odin tests the wisdom of Jotun Valthradnir. Odin said, say it first, if your mind is able, and you, Wastradnir, know where the earth and the sky above originally came from, you clever Jotun. The earth was created out of the flesh of Ymir, and out of his bones the mountains, the sky from the skull of Jotun, and out of his blood the sea. To the closest thing, where was originally Orgelmir, the first Jotun, with Jotun's sons, where do you Jotun wisely? Of Eli Wagga the Arctic Ocean, the drops of pus sprinkled, and it grew and became a Jotun, therefore all come into our tribe, so we are a fierce generation. To the seventh, how did he come to the children of the corner of Jotun without a favour of Big, that is, woman's favour? Among the arms, it is said, the maid and man grew out of the rice-hers, foot with foot produced a 6-man son for Jotun. On the 11th, in what place do the men tend to meet daily for battle? All converes in Odin's court meet daily for battle, demand and fall each other, ride home from battle, sit down as friends. I fanage around a lot, many things I learned, many times the powers of fate try. What does people live when the timber winter, the terrible one, is over? Life, and Lithre, the urge to live, are hidden in Hodman's grove, the Mesenchenkinder eat morning dew, they live on this for a long time. What are the saints of the heritage when the Lohe sits, the firehole, goes out? Wider and Wali in the Godahof reigned whence its Lohe goes out, Modi and Magni are said to have Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, when Mingnir, that is, Thor, clears the field. Who will put an end to Odin's when the ice perish? The wolf Fenrir will devour the father of men, but Wider will avenge him, splitting the cold pine tree in battle with the wolf.